Alright, fix that. So that was just about that remark, so we'll go on to remark 2. Joshua, do you want the PDF, by the way? Because I can just link it to you if you have access to being able to read it. I don't know. Alright, so reading remark 2. Yet another reason can be cited that helps to explain the resistance to the proposition about being and nothing. This reason is that, as expressed in the proposition, being and nothing are one and the same. The result of considering being and nothing is incomplete. The accent falls primarily on the being one and the same, as is the case in judgment generally, where the predicate says what the subject is. Consequently, the sense seems to be that the distinction is denied, which yet patently occurs in the proposition at the same time. For the proposition says both determinations, being and nothing, and contains them as distinguished. At the same time, the meaning cannot be that abstraction ought to be made from two determinations and only their unity retained. This sense would be manifestly one-sided, since that from which abstraction would be made is equally present in the proposition and explicitly named there. Now, insofar as the proposition being and nothing are the same expresses the identity of these determinations, yet in fact equally contains the two as distinguished, it internally contradicts itself and thus dissolves itself. And if we concentrate on this result, what we have before us is a proposition which, on closer inspection, turns out to vanish spontaneously. It has movement, but in this vanishing it is its proper content which comes to be in it, namely becoming. So I discussed this at the end of last time, well, close to the end, and I think I made it pretty clear back in that time. Continuing to the next paragraph, the proposition thus contains the result. It is this result implicit in it. But the circumstance to which we must pay attention here is the defect that this result is not itself expressed in the proposition. It is external reflection that recognizes it there. Sorry. I'm slowly rereading that. Okay, so he's talking about the whole vanishing of the proposition and contradiction in the first paragraph. That if we grasp the truth of the proposition being and nothing are one and the same, we see that it is a contradiction. The proposition dissolves itself, vanishes, and therefore, becomes properly becoming. But this is not, he says it right there, it's only implicit in the proposition, but it's not explicit. And so in order to see it, we must externally reflect on it and bring in this content in the way in which we interpret it. It's not something that we can just read it and really just say, yes, clearly you must see this result in it. So you could interpret this in such a way that you get the proper result of vanishing. You wouldn't get it just from the content itself. Continuing, in this connection, we must observe right at the beginning that the proposition in the form of a judgment is not adept to express speculative truths. Recognition of this circumstance would go a long way in preventing many misunderstandings of speculative truths. Judgment joins subject and object in connection of identity. Abstraction is therefore made from the fact that the subject has yet more determinacies than the predicate has, just as the predicate is wider than the subject. Now, if the content is speculative, the non-identity of subject and predicate is also an essential moment, but this is not expressed in judgment. The paradoxical and even bizarre light in which much of recent philosophy is cast, for those not intimate with speculative thought, is due in many ways to the form of the simple judgment when used to convey speculative truths. So the issue of speculative propositions is that uh, the form is too constraining to express the full truth. So though this is technically the technical term that is used in the scholarship here is speculative propositions, by the way. So when philosophers or anyone who's engaging in something kind of philosophical says something as a speculative truth, a speculative proposition, they tend to say things, like all is one and blah blah blah, or being and nothing are one and the same, and they are often misunderstood because the very form in which it is said just is incapable of expressing directly what is really meant. So you have to tease it out of the person who claims these things. When you're new to this kind of thinking, what they fully mean by it, because the original expression cannot say it fully. Continuing, for the purpose of expressing the speculative truth, the defect is first remedied by adding the contrary proposition, namely, being and nothing are not the same, which we also stated above. But another defect then crops up, for these propositions are disconnected and therefore present their content only in an antinomy, whereas the content refers to one and the same thing, and the determinations expressed in the two propositions should be united absolutely, in a union which can then only be said to be an unrest of simultaneous incompatibles, a movement. So there's something you should highlight if you haven't.
Mm, not sure. I'm trying to get it. I guess there are things I get, but not
Uh,
completely.
yeah, he's gonna explain it right now. So just keep your questions in mind. So continuing. The commonest injustice done to a speculative content is to render it one-sidedly, that is, to give prominence only to one of the propositions in which it can be resolved. This proposition is then undeniably asserted, but the statement is just as false as it is correct, for once one proposition is taken out of its speculative context, the other also must be given at least as much attention and articulation. Attention must also be drawn at this point to, so to speak, the unfortunate word unity. Unity, even more so than identity, designates a subjective reflection. It is normally taken as any connection that arises from comparison, from external reflection. Inasmuch as this reflection finds the same thing in two different subject matters, a unity is there with respect to which complete indifference is presupposed on the part of the subject matters compared, so that the comparing and the unity do not touch these subject matters themselves, but are rather a doing and a determining external to them. Unity thus expresses a totally abstract sameness, and it will sound all the harsher and the more discordant the more the terms of which it is asserted show themselves to be utterly distinct. For this reason, it would therefore be better to say simply unseparatedness and inseparability, but then the affirmative aspect of the connection of the whole would not be expressed. So speculative truths are, to our common understanding, contradictions. He here talks about the antinomies, which are Kantian, in which you have two opposite claims, which, in their own respective standpoints, are true, but considered from an opposite standpoint, are not true. And so speculative truths are a union, which can then only be said to be an unrest of simultaneous incompatibles movement. But I mean, he keeps bringing up this point that that you don't see this except with external reflections. That this, for example, the unrest does not happen unless you think about things speculatively. The whole thing of being is and being is nothing is not going to immediately crop up unless you really are thinking speculatively about it, which is to speculate in thinking its content and making its content itself into a form or another object of thinking. So with speculative propositions, you say being nothing are one and the same. It's true, but it's also false, because being and nothing are clearly also not the same, because if they weren't, why would you be having these distinct terms show up in the proposition in the first place?
It's maybe kind of uh, the unity that is expressed at the beginning of self-consciousness, where I well, there were these two relations. First, uh, first the tautological one, I am I, and on the other side the this relation which said that I am um, appear. I don't remember if it was exactly like that, but I am forces. Uh, I am phenomena in some way. It is still just a unity because uh, we we can assert it, but we still can see how that is not the case. One side is has one content and the other side has another content, even if formally we can assert their unity or their equal, um, or that they are equal.
Yeah, it's exactly like that. Remember that at the end of force, we get the concept of infinity, in which we get the typically a speculative proposition, which is the difference, which is no difference. And that so self-consciousness begins with that, in which it experiences the other object as something different, but uh, its own experience of knowledge up to then has shown it that at least differences are ultimately not differences. They cannot be. And yet they are differences. And so it makes the mistakes of, well, it's a difference that is no difference. And it takes the side of no difference. It takes the side of absolute unity and says everything is me. I am I and I am everything. But in its own experience, as well as our cognition of it, that's obviously not true. It is true, and it's not true. It's true because we see that there is clearly an immanent connection between, the self and phenomena, the self and other, and yet we also see that, like, obviously there must, like, these things are not like these false illusions. they're real. They really are differences. They exist. So the issue is the whole paradox of antinomies. Two things which are true, which from different perspectives are false. And yet somehow we're supposed to hold them as both true. On the point of unity, where he says unity is abstract, I think he's talking about the regular way we take unity to be, which just everyday way we talk about unities, and we say, oh, two dogs walk by and say, oh, those dogs are together, they're unity. Those rocks, are they're clumped together, they're unity. But that unity is completely external, We're the ones who see it and construct it. It's not really immanent to it. Therefore, he says the unity is an indifference to the subject matters. So that's why he's wary of the term unity as in that, it kind of gives a really vague picture of what he wants to say, but it doesn't give the right picture. Well, I mean, as a matter of fact, nothing can give the right picture, but I mean, you get the point. The concept, it's like the whole linguistic problem of the non-being. Like it gives the wrong impression if you really think about it literally, and you go by your regular experience of what the term means. So Hegel does not want to, Hegel, unlike most, doesn't want to redefine words that already exist in our lexicon and bend them to something which they really are not. So he could define unity as a sublation or blah blah blah, but then it just creates a whole linguistic problem of people coming in and just assuming they know what the word means and taking the regular meaning of the term and misreading what he means.
Yes, he's respecting the Western tradition.
Yeah, which most should, quite frankly. I mean, I don't know if you encountered it, especially in analytic philosophy, when you meet people and they're like, well, what are your axioms? And they tell you, well, economics for me means this, and you kind of want to. It kind of becomes infuriating because it literally becomes a whole word game, of which they know you mean something by the same word that they mean something else, and they are not willing to ever engage the content. They stick with their superficialities, and they just say, well, economics isn't that for me, and they dismiss you, or you dismiss them for the same reasons. I hate that. I see too many people talk to each other that way. It's just absolutely stupid.
Yes, I hate that too. I kinda respect Wittgenstein one for being mad at, at that.
Uh, yeah, or yesterday I was reading this. It definitely happens with socialism. Also happens with key terms. Like yesterday I was reading this stupid thread on Reddit, on debate communism or something. And some guy comes in and says, doesn't communism have a state by this definition? And he used a pretty common sense definition, and the socialist just pulled out the Marxist definition and says, well, that's not what a state technically is. And you just kind of want to, I don't know, for me it's kind of, I want to facepalm because it's a disingenuous argument, really.
Yeah, that it's kind of the fear of the word state. It's just a word.
Yeah. Yeah, Hegel definitely cares more about conveying what exactly he wants to say, but he also doesn't want to just. It's not that he doesn't care about words, because if he didn't care, he would just say, "Well, look, I define this as this, and I'll just use this word, this set of symbols to mean this." He thinks the way that people use language, and the way language is already set by common definitions, is what things, more or less really are. And that when you're trying to make philosophical language, you should fit your philosophical meanings to the everyday terms that already are in the spirit of what you mean. That way you do the least violence to the regular understanding, as well as do the best that you can to actually convey what you really mean in a way that doesn't immediately cause this total clash with the regular language. So, as I was saying, someone like Hegel would totally be against this whole idea of just defining the state in abstract, not taking note of what the normal person means by that word, and just giving a completely different definition. It just doesn't work. He thinks that just sets you up for failure, and I totally agree. I think that's absolutely true. It sets you up for failure when you encounter somebody who just won't step out of the common understanding and accept your definition, just no question. Yeah, actually, that's kind of why we use it, because it sort of fits. It's also memes. Yeah, I wouldn't even mention it. I would just talk about it as if it's just a fact. All right. So continuing. So the whole true result that we have here before us is becoming, but a becoming which is not the merely one-sided or abstract unity of being and nothing. It consists rather in this movement, that pure being is immediate and simple, and for that very reason is just as much pure nothing. That the distinction between them is, but equally sublates itself and is not. This result does also assert, therefore, the distinction of being and nothing, but it asserts it as one which is merely intended. So once again, um, well, actually no, I don't know. I don't think he mentioned this before already. The whole thing about intention is to once again point out the fact that the distinction between being and nothing is not immanent. Um, it's really an external thing, because the whole reason we come up with the concept of nothing is a subjective determination we make that there is a difference which we experience in the fact of having intended to mean something by being and getting an empty content out of it, which normally in regular language we would call nothing. That is not an immanent thing for the concept. It's an external reflection which we as subjects intend. So as far the difference is originally intended, the identity is logical because we obviously have the content being logically the same. we think the same thing in both of them. So the unity is logically, once the distinction is arbitrarily made, subjectively intended, the unity, though, follows logically because they have the same content. Makes sense.
Sorry, can you repeat, please?
That the original difference between being and nothing is an intended difference. Because remember that the way we get nothing is that we think through being, we find that this thinking is empty, it's contentless, we don't think anything. So we take this to match the term which normally we would call nothing. So we make this distinction between being and its content. We don't refer it as that, though it's kind of implicitly there. I mean, it's very implicit, kind of more almost explicit. The form and content distinction, which being is the form, the content is nothing. But why would we think that we could make that distinction in the first place? We just do. And why would we give the content a different name than the form? We just do. We intend that difference. It's a subjective intention. But once we get the intention split and we have two concepts, being and nothing, the content which both of them have is the same. So the unity is logical.
Oh, okay.
Continuing, the ordinary assumption is that being is the absolutely other of nothing, and that there is nothing as clear as this absolute distinction. Indeed, nothing seems easier than being able to state it, but it is just as easy to convince oneself that this is impossible, that the distinction is unsayable. Let those who insist on the distinction of being and nothing, let them just try to state in what the distinction consists. So notice that unsayable, the italicized, emphasized. So the whole way we're going with this is completely in the realm of thought and completely in the realm of language. Because language is the existence of thought. Something Hegel mentions in the Phenomenology of Spirit. He says language is the Dasein of spirit. It's the being there of mind, the existence of mind, and mind exists in thought. Mind is thought. So insofar as we're referring to the difference of being and nothing as thoughts, if we remain in the immanence of thought, he's indeed right. We cannot say at all what the difference is. We have no recourse from within them alone to speak of a difference.
That was Wittgensteinian as fuck. At least from that standpoint, unsayable is in some way the same as unthinkable.
Yes.
But I don't know if Hegel arrives to that conclusion in the end. At least for one proposition, it seems that unsayable is unthinkable. Maybe with the movement of propositions, what is unsayable in only one can be thinkable in the movement of the totality of them.
Yeah, keep that in mind. Continuing, if being and nothing had any determinateness differentiating them, then, as we said, they would be determinate being and determinate nothing, not the pure being and the pure nothing which they still are at this point. Their distinction is therefore completely empty. Each is as indeterminate as the other. The distinction depends, therefore, not on them but on a third element, on intention. But intention is a form of subjectivity, and subjectivity does not belong to the present order of exposition. The third element in which being and nothing have their subsistence must, however, also be present here. And it is present indeed. It is becoming. In becoming, they are present as distinct. Becoming only occurs to the extent that they are distinguishable. This third is an other than they. They subsist only in an other, which is as equivalent to saying that they do not subsist on their own.
Mhm.
Okay, so this links immediately to the end of consciousness section in the phenomenology. Or to the beginning of self-consciousness.
Sort of, not quite yet. Definitely becoming is in play.
Yeah, but because of this third element of subjectivity, which does not belong to the order of exposition, but is required for it.
Oh, yeah. Definitely. Where was I? Becoming is equally the subsistence of being and of non-being, of their subsistence, or their subsistence is only their being in a one. Precisely this, their subsistence in a one, is that which equally sublates their distinction. So yeah, that definitely links directly to the concept of infinity at the end of consciousness as well. Continuing, the challenge to produce the distinction between being and nothing also brings with it the challenge to state what, then, is being and what is nothing. Those who resist acknowledging that the two are equally only a transition of the one into the other, and who assert this or that about being and nothing, let them declare whereof they speak, that is, let them advance a definition of being and nothing, and let them demonstrate that it is correct. Without having satisfied this first demand of the ancient science, whose logical rules they otherwise accept and apply, all their assertions about being and nothing are only assurances without scientific validity. If it has somewhere been said that existence, which is held from the start to be equivalent to being, is the completion of possibility, then another determination, namely possibility, is presupposed along with it. So being is not declared in its immediacy, but precisely as not standing on its own, as conditioned. For being which is mediated, we shall reserve the expression concrete existence. But the common practice is to imagine being as if it were a picture of pure light, the clarity of unclouded seeing, and then nothing as the pure night, and the distinction between the two is then enshrined into this well-known sensuous difference. But in fact, if this very seeing is more accurately imagined, one can readily perceive that in absolute light one sees just as much and just as little as in absolute darkness.
I can read if you need me to.
That the one seeing is just as good as the other, that pure seeing is as a seeing of nothing. Pure light and pure darkness are two voids that amount to the same thing. Only indeterminate light and light is determined through darkness, in clouded light therefore, just as only in determinate darkness, and darkness is determined through light, in illuminated darkness therefore, can something be distinguished, since only clouded light and illuminated darkness have distinction in them, and hence are determinate being, existence.
This was a great ending. Uh, it made it a lot clearer for me.
Yeah, I think actually the example of light is brilliant and it's perfect. It fits. It should give you the exact meaning of like. It's like the sensuous meaning. It literally is art. It's the exact sensuous appearance of what the concept is, if it needs an appearance at all. In which, pure light and pure darkness. In either one, you see nothing. There is no content.
Also, it is introduced the concept, the fundamental concept of mediation.
Precisely, and why becoming is going to be the meeting place of being and nothing. So two indeterminacies which on their own reveal nothing and have nothing to be said about them together come, well, when they come together, actually reveal something in their coming together. Yeah, I think I probably should. That should probably be the example I give. Yeah, I'll edit that later. So, let's see, what else could be said? I don't know, this actually also gets at one point, which I think like people accuse Hegel of. Sorry, dog's going crazy. All right, sorry, that was back. So big point about that short remark was the difference we make is intentional, and though we make the difference, it is a legitimate difference. We just don't know why it's legitimate at this point, conceptually. Eventually, somewhere, I think, according to someone's comment on Facebook on this issue, that this difference explained finally in the second book, which is the Doctrine of Essence. So though we begin with it illegitimately, it is legitimate difference. We just don't know what it is at the beginning.
So this thing about intention is that as some kind of spontaneous thinking, it allows for imagination, which is like kind of more trivial form of thinking. So the distinction between the first distinction we made, or difference we made about being and nothing, does not come from does come from somewhere. It is not completely flowed. So the thing is, this is a correct between two abstract concepts. Even if they are abstract, it is a correct differentiation. So when we are advancing, when we discover how it was that this imagination came, and we understand that it was because we made abstraction of concrete existence phenomena, that we could arrive to that imagination. And that was because of mediation of the way we mediate that phenomena, which is concrete existence. But paradoxically, what we perceive in the first moment is not the concrete existence, but the abstraction, because to think is to abstract.
Yeah. Actually, like, take note of like what you said, in which this actually applies almost to every conception that we ever have, in which one of the neat things that the logic isn't just the logic of these things. You eventually will realize that this is literally the logic of how you really do think real concepts of any kind. You know, you encounter things in immediacy, you have an abstract concept which is in itself as a concept indeterminate. And then you start qualifying it, you start getting determinacies, you start getting qualities, you start quantifying, you start doing all these other things which complete the totality of the appearance of the thing. And then you start going to like, well, you know, what lies behind the appearance, what really makes the dog, and you start getting into biology, genetics, you start getting into other things. And you know, why does this biology and genetics do these things? Why does it work this way? And you start getting to the level of concepts in which you start having to think about things which are self-determining, and etc. But I mean, the uniqueness of this indeterminacy is only for thought, though. Only thought ever gets to this such extreme abstraction, which it is purely, or well, it takes itself to be purely indeterminate, even though in action it is not. So we'll go on to Remark 3. I'm not sure if we'll finish Remark 3. I forget how long it is. I think it's either long or there's a Remark 4. Either way, I think we should definitely read at least as much as we can up till about 6.
Yeah, this is one of the longest remarks. And there is a remark for. It's about 10 pages.
It almost finishes the chapter.
We can go over it. I mean, like I'll always do a review. So when we come back to it, we'll just be because that way we do this, and next time we'll probably finish chapter 1, which will be great.
Yeah, it's okay. I'm with energy today.
All right, Remarks 3. Can you read Hyperion?
Yeah, sure. Remark 3. The unity whose moments, being in nothing, are inseparable, is at the same time different from these moments. Thus it stands as a third with respect to them. A third which, in its most proper form, is becoming. Transition is the same as becoming, except that the two terms, from one of which the transition is made to the other, are represented in it more as at rest outside each other, the transition occurring between them. Now, wherever and however being or nothing are at issue, this third must be there. For the two have no subsistence on their own, but are only in becoming in this third. But this third has various empirical shapes that abstraction either sets aside or neglects for the sake of holding fast to its two products, being and nothing, each for itself, and showing them as protected against transition. Such a simple maneuver of abstraction can be countered with equal ease simply by pointing to the empirical, concrete existence in which that abstraction itself is only a something, has a determinate existence. Or else it is by virtue of other forms of reflection that this separation of the inseparable would be held fixed. But in any such determination of reflection, its opposite is present within it, in and for itself, and it is thus possible to refute it on its own terms without going back to the nature of the fact and appealing to it, by taking the determination as it presents itself, and by pointing to its other in it. It would be labor in vain to attempt to ensnare, so to speak, all the shifts and turns of reflection and its argumentation in order to preempt and render impossible all the evasions and the leaps with which it hides its own contradiction from itself. For this reason, I also refrain from taking notice of any self-styled objections and refutations that have been advanced against the claim that neither being nor nothing are something true, but that becoming is their truth. The intellectual education required to perceive the nothingness of these refutations, or rather to dispel such arbitrary ideas on one's own, will be attained only through a critical cognition of the forms of the understanding. But those who are the most prolific in such objections straightway set themselves upon reflecting on the first propositions, without helping themselves, or having helped themselves through further study of the logic, to the awareness of the nature of their crude reflections. You want me to stop there so we can talk, all right?
Yeah, unless somebody has questions.
Any questions?
No, seems
Okay. We shall consider some of the cases that occur when being and nothing are posited in isolation, each outside the sphere of the other, with the result that the transition is negated. Parmenides held fast to being and was the most consistent, since he also said of nothing that it absolutely is not, but only being is. Totally for itself, being is thus the indeterminate, and has therefore no connecting reference to any other. Consequently, it seems that from this beginning, no further movement forward is possible. That is, from the beginning itself, and that an advance can only occur by adding something foreign to it from outside. The advance, where being is the same as nothing, thus appears as a second, absolute beginning, a transition which is for itself, and that would be added to being externally. Being would not be an absolute beginning at all if it had a determinateness. In that case, it would depend on another, and would not be immediate, would not be the beginning. If, however, it is indeterminate, and is therefore a true beginning, it has nothing by virtue of which it can pass over to another. As beginning, it is equally the end. It is just as impossible for anything to break out of it as to break into it. With Parmenides, as with Spinoza, there is no advance from from being, or from absolute substance to the negative, the finite. If there is forward movement, nevertheless, something which, as just remarked, can only occur externally if we start from being devoid of any connecting reference, and so without forward movement, then this advance is a second, new beginning. Thus Fichte's most absolute, unconditional first principle, A equals A, is a positing, a thesis. The second principle is a counterpositing, an antithesis. This latter should be partly conditioned, partly unconditioned, and so contradiction in itself. This is an advance by external reflection that negates the absolute with which it makes its beginning. The counterpositing is the negation of the first identity, while at the same time equally reducing its second absolute explicitly to something conditioned. But if there were any justification at all for the advance, that is, for sublating the first beginning, then the possibility that an other could connect with it would have to lie in the nature of this first beginning itself. The beginning would have to be, therefore, a determinate being. But being, as also the absolute substance, will not be such, quite the contrary. Being is the immediate, the still absolutely indeterminate. The most eloquent, perhaps most
Wait,
forgotten.
hold on. All right, hold on.
Okay. Yeah, I thought we needed to talk about that.
So, I know Sora knows Spinoza quite a lot better than I do. What do you think about his comment there?
yes. Here I can see how it is that um, not making substance the 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 fundamental element of Hegel's philosophy is not just a game of words, but that the concept of substance is what it could kill Hegel's philosophy. That is because in the first propositions of Spinoza's ethics, um, because substance is defined as that which is the only thing that exists in itself, it is negated the possibility of an outside thing. So if we retain substance as the as the, as the first element to begin the philosophizing, we are dead in Hegel's philosophy. Hegel's philosophy should be negate is not a word, but the best word, but there will be no way for Hegel's philosophy. Like Spinoza in the first part, assures him of that there could be that the logical consistency of Spinoza's system is dependent on the logical concept of substance, and that there is nothing outside of it.
Yeah, nothing that is not it. So everything becomes an internal positing from experience as well. It's just what Spinoza takes to not contradict substance is what goes further. But from the concept of substance, the others are not derived. On the point on Fichte, where he says, thus Fichte's most absolute unconditional first principle, A equals A, is a positing, a thesis. The second principle is a counterpositing, an antithesis. The latter should be partly conditioned, partly unconditioned. This is an advance by external reflection that negates the absolute with which it makes its beginning. The counterpositing is a negation of the first identity, while at the same time equally reducing its second absolute explicitly to something conditioned. So the first A is, let's take it this way. The first A is the absolute. It's the absolute ego. Whatever that means. I've read some things, and some people take that to be the individual ego. Some people take that to be like God ego, an abstract, universal ego. I don't know. But anyway, so the first one's supposed to be absolute. It posits the second one. But it only exists because in the second one it has posited itself. But if that is the case, then the first A, which posits the second A as its own existence, cannot possibly be absolute. Because then the second A it's the condition on it, which is its own existence. Without it, it wouldn't exist, and therefore it wouldn't be absolute. But then that second A also cannot be posited if it is not, in a minimal sense, different from the first A. It cannot be this false difference, it must be a real difference. And so, that's how that's contradictory. The first A is supposed to be absolute, yet it must posit itself, creates its positing, but its positing therefore is the realization of its absoluteness, yet it also isn't its absoluteness. It's partially absolute, partially conditioned. And both of them work this way, which is weird. It actually makes more sense when you get like the full expanded
Yeah.
argument. The full expanded argument for this makes a lot more sense than what I'm saying it like in this really condensed way.
That is found in Fichte's Science of Knowledge.
Yeah, it's 10 pages, and Christ, it's autistic to read.
Yeah, we went through it and we had a tough time, but we finally figured it out.
I do have a blog on it if you guys ever want to look at it. So anyways, the recap of that is obviously you can't have a pure principle at the beginning which then does not from itself generate anything new, and so the beginning is the end if you leave it at that, but that's not what we want ever, not even Parmenides. So we have to say other things, and the only thing we can say those other things is, well, we take whatever we think doesn't contradict the first, but nonetheless it does contradict the first, because at the very least the first is supposedly the absolute and unconditioned, yet in relating other things subordinate to it, nonetheless we've also made it partly relative, so it's a contradiction.
Sorry. Kinda want to reformulate uh, between the uh, between the English and confusion. I was not that clear.
Sure.
Yes. The 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 thing is mm, that if we have substance, that if we assume substance, and for me it was pretty logical to assume substance as the first logical and ontological thing. Then Spinoza's ontology is flawless. If I can read some propositions. Here you have proposition 6. One substance cannot be produced by another substance. Proposition 7. Existence belongs to the nature of substances. Proposition 5. There cannot exist in the universe two or more substances having the same nature or attribute. And to be a substance means that an attribute is of its essence. So there cannot exist in the universe two or more substances. So the thing is, with this starting point, there is no way to tell Spinoza, you are incorrect. There must be an outside thing that negates. No, it's impossible. So the only way is to negate the concept of substance as the starting point of ontology as such. And that's why Hegel, I don't know, he clearly avoids that word most of the time.
Yeah. That's part of it, and the other part is that he doesn't want to. Also, doesn't want to do it like Spinoza does, in which notice that Spinoza must define substance and add attributes and modes to it, which don't contradict it, and therefore, it logically works in the formal logic, but which he doesn't have any explanation as to why they should be part of substance. Like, how from substance these things are generate from substance. So that's what Hegel's is particularly critiquing there. That from substance alone, you do not get existence. From substance alone, you do not, unless what you're claiming is an analytic derivation, in which you're saying, oh, what I'm really just doing is just drawing out of substance what is already given in its definition.
Yes, that is because that is why Hegel was criticizing before this philosophy as the philosophy of identity, where negativity does not exist. But in some way, in this part of we are reading now, is a more strong strike to Spinoza's, because before, to say that it is the philosophy of identity and thus it is incorrect, it is not that conclusive. That is the point of Spinoza. That is what he is defending. That actually things can be all the same. That there is no more than movement. That is. He kinds of equates his ontology, so like if you have a sea, and in the sea there are waves, so you can see forms, you can see things which looks as different, but they are not. So in some way, at this point, that was, you could say, yeah, he was correct. But at this point of Hegel analysis, page 71 that we are now, I think it is more difficult for keep maintaining Spinoza's logical principles.
All right. And let's see, continuing. The most eloquent, perhaps most forgotten account of the impossibility of advancing from an abstraction to something beyond it, and of uniting the two, are given by Jacobi in support of his polemic against the Kantian a priori synthesis of self-consciousness in his treatise concerning the undertaking of the critique to reduce reason to the understanding. He defines the task as one of demonstrating the originating of the producing of a synthesis in a pure somewhat, be it consciousness, space, or time. Let space be a one, time a one, consciousness a one. Now, do say how any of these three ones purely turns itself internally into a manifold. Each is a one and no other, and all the sameness, just selfhood in general, without a he-hood, a she-hood, or it-hood. For these still slumber together with the he, she, it, in the infinite zero of the indeterminate from which each and every determinate being has yet to proceed. What brings finitude into these infinitudes? What impregnates space and time a priori with number and measure and turns them into a pure manifold? What brings pure spontaneity, I, into oscillation? How does its pure vowel sound come out of its concomitant sound, the consonant? Or better, how does its soundless, uninterrupted sounding interrupt itself and break off in order to gain at least some kind of self-sound and accent? One sees that Jacobi very distinctly recognized that abstraction is a non-entity, whether this non-entity is the so-called absolute, only abstract space, or the equally abstract time or abstract pure consciousness, the I. He insists on this non-entity for the sake of maintaining the impossibility of any advance to an other, which is the condition of a synthesis, and to a synthesis itself. The synthesis which is the point of interest here must not be taken as tying together of external determinations already at hand. Rather, the issue is twofold. One of the genesis of a second next to a first, of a determinate something next to something which is initially indeterminate, but also one of immanent synthesis, of synthesis a priori, a unity of distinct terms that exists in and for itself. Becoming is this immanent synthesis of being and nothing, but because the sense most closely attached to synthesis is that of an external gathering of things externally at hand, the name synthesis of synthetic unity has rightly gone out of use. So there's your explanation of why he doesn't call it synthesis, instead he calls it sublation.
Wow.
So is it clear what the whole issue, the space as a one, time as a one, consciousness as a one, and how it's not different from like the I as a one?
Yeah, me neither.
So let's see.
Got clear.
So he mentions up on the previous page, uniting the two are given by Jacobi in support of his polemic against the Kantian a priori synthesis of self-consciousness. So the a priori synthesis of self-consciousness is, I think, I'm not quite fully sure, I'm pretty sure but not certain, that this is the transcendental unity of apperception, in which
Yes, I
whatever,
think
whatever, yeah. Well, so that universal consciousness of sorts, like, brings together the elements that make consciousness possible. Like, it brings together the elements of it is what makes possible the uniting of the elements of experience. You know, sight, sound, the senses, the categories of the mind, categories of objects, transcendental logic. It brings them together, synthesizes them, and that is what causes empirical self-consciousness, or what causes, what we could call consciousness in general. And I think it seems like Jacobi's point says, like, well, just because you say there is a transcendental unity of apperception doesn't tell you how in the hell you go from, well, there is a transcendental, like, unity to it's a transcendental unity which will include these things and those things, in their manifold, distinct things brought together. So he says, you could say space is a one, time is a one, consciousness is a one. Now, do say how any of these three ones purely turns itself internally into a manifold. Each in is a one and no other, and all the sameness, just as selfhood in general without hehood, blah, blah, blah. In the infinite, for these still slumber together with a he, she, it, in the infinite zero of the indeterminate from which each and every determinate being has yet to proceed. What brings finitude into these three infinitudes? what impregnates space and time a priori with number and measure and turns them into pure manifold, what brings pure spontaneity I into oscillation. So, what brings difference into what originally has no difference? You have a unity in the transcendental unity of apperception, but why does this unify perceptions? Why does it unify sense experiences? Why does it unify categories with these, unify sense experiences, sense data, whatever you want to call it, into like categories, which then are brought together within the self? And and so Kant's answer is he never tells you why. Kant just says, look, this is what happens and what has to happen, but there's no reasoning as to why this should happen. Why do these things come together?
That kind of makes me think about the analogy I made before about the sea and the waves of the sea. Like I could think of that in Spinoza's system and here in Kant, but why and why does that happen? Why does the sea have waves, and why are they in that, and why do they have that form?
Yeah. So from the transcendental unity of perception, we don't actually get a source for experience. We just get another element for the necessary conditions for the possibility of experience. But it actually, a lot of people seem to think that it's one of the linchpins of Kantianism, but it really isn't, because it's sort of derived too backwards, but you can't derive forwards from it. You can't think the unity of the self and then say, yes, experience and sights and sounds and all these things. Nope. So if the self was an absolute, or if we took the self to be an absolute, you can't go on to anything new. Another one is also more general, the difference of just how does one thing connect to another? How is it that being becomes nothing? How can being and nothing be connected if they really are absolutely different? There had to be some underlying connector, but then you'd have to explain why does that connector connect them? Why do they even have a connection to that connector? If being and nothing, and there's the third term, becoming, why do being and nothing relate to becoming? If you took it that way. So, this is just also a general argument against the possibility of going from any one single term. Doesn't matter how determinate, doesn't matter, if it's essentially determinate or not. If you truly do the job of abstracting it, you're going to have no way to go from that to anywhere. At least that's what Jacobi thinks. So whether you start with absolute abstraction or you start with abstracted determinacy, such as substance, you still have the issue of movement. Why does it move? How are you going to go from here to there? And the only way you can do it is external reflection. All right, continuing. We were at about the middle. Jacobi asks, how does the pure vowel of the I come into its concomitant sound to the consonant? What brings determinacy to indeterminateness? The question of the what would be easy to answer, and has been answered by Kant in this way. The question of the how, however, means in what way and manner, in what relation, and so forth, and requires the application of a particular category. But there can be no question here of a way or of a manner, of the categories of the understanding. The question of the how is itself one that belongs to the bad practices of reflection, which demands comprehensibility, but for that it presupposes its fixed categories and is thereby assured from the start to be forearmed against the answer to what it asks. Nor does the question have in Jacobi the higher sense of a query regarding the necessity of the synthesis. For Jacobi, as we said, remains fixed in the abstractions in order to assert the impossibility of the synthesis. Especially graphic is this description of the procedure for attaining the abstraction of space. So just stopping for a bit, the noticing of he says like Kant answers the question of what is synthesized, obviously. But he doesn't answer the question of how, which is how is it synthesized, which it's the hard question really. But then notice that Hegel obviously then attacks this very question of how, saying that asking how is presupposing categories, such as you have a presupposition of certain ways in which things must be possible, and you're asking how in your own presuppositions that is possible. So like a scientist asks like, how is a miracle possible? When he's asking you that, he's really asking you, how is it on my understanding of the world, my presuppositions, that you can make sense of this for me? I understand things according to physics, according to laws of nature, blah blah blah. And when he asks you how, he's asking you according to those presuppositions. So when Jacobi is asking how is it possible that synthesis, how is synthesis possible? And then he goes on and uses his own ways of reflecting, which he has his own categories, in which he has his own way of understanding things. And then through his own way, he proves, indeed, that it's not possible. So, Hegel says he's already forearmed himself against the answer to what it asks. So, it always be wary of that question. It gives you a reason to be wary of that question. Because it's not always an honest one. Alright, going back. Continuing, especially graphic is his description of the procedure for attaining the abstraction of space. For a time, I must try clean to forget that I ever saw anything, heard, touched, or moved anything, myself expressly not exempted. Clean must I forget all movement, and let precisely this forgetting be my most pressing concern, since it is the hardest. Just as I have thought all things away, so must I also get perfectly rid of them all, retaining nothing at all except the intuition which violently held its ground of the infinite immutable space. I may not therefore think even myself back into it as something distinguished from it yet equally bound to it. I may not let myself be merely surrounded and pervaded by it, but I must rather give myself over to it totally, become a one with it, transform myself into it. I must allow no leftover of myself except this, my intuition itself, in order to behold it as a true self-subsisting, independent, single, and sole representation. Sounds a lot with what people try to do in meditation. I mean, you don't do it. It's not conceptually done, but it's experientially done. Like it's literally the same process. But continuing with this totally abstract purity of continuity that is, with this indeterminateness and emptiness of representation, it is indifferent whether one names this abstraction space, or pure intuition, or pure thought. It is altogether the same as what an Indian calls Brahma, when for years on end, looking only at the tip of his nose, externally motionless and equally unmoved in sensation, representation, fantasy, desire, and so on, he inwardly sends only Om, 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 or else says nothing at all. This dull, empty consciousness, taken as consciousness, is just this, being. See, told you. He said it right after I said it. Continuing.
Let's transform this in a session of yoga.
Continuing, in this void, Jacobi now states further, he encounters the opposite of what should happen to him according to Kant's assurance. He does not find himself to be a many and a manifold, but to be rather a one without any plurality and manifoldness. Indeed, I am impossibility itself, the annihilating of all things manifold and plural, cannot, from my pure, absolutely simple and unchanging essence, produce again, or conjure in me a shadow, even the least bit of anything. Thus all externality and juxtaposition, and any manifoldness and plurality of dependent on them, are revealed in this purity as a pure impossibility. So, I mean, I have no idea. I haven't read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, so I don't know exactly what he says about the transcendental unity of perception. But I do know he says, it's what creates the manifold of experience. I don't know if he says the self is a manifold. So, but taking Jacobi's word for it, it seems he does. And if he does, then obviously Jacobi's little thought experiment or meditation refutes it pretty handily. And let's see, let's read, I think, like 2 paragraphs more. Well, we've only really done like an hour and like 25 minutes because we waited for a while for people to show up, which didn't show up. But yeah, we'll hurry up. Like we're getting close to his thing on finishing the thing in Jacobi. That's why I want to. Let's see. The meaning of this impossibility is nothing else than the tautology. The meaning of this impossibility is... Oh my god, fat boy. Comes outside just to start barking. The meaning of this impossibility is nothing else than a tautology. I hold fast to abstract unity and exclude all plurality and manifoldness. I keep myself in indistinctness and indeterminacy and look away from anything distinguished and determinate. Kant's a priori synthesis of self-consciousness, that is, the work of this unity of differentiating itself, but in this differentiation of preserving itself, is diluted by Jacobi to just this abstraction. He one-sidedly reduces that synthesis in itself, the original parting of judgment, to the copula in itself, and is, without beginning and end, without what, who, or which. This repetition of repetition ad infinitum is the one single occupation, function, and reproduction and production of the purest of all pure syntheses. The synthesis is itself this mere pure absolute repetition. Though in fact, since there is no pause in it, that is, no negation, no distinguishing, the synthesis is not a repetition, but rather undifferentiated simple being. But then, is this still a synthesis when Jacobi leaves out precisely that which makes the unity a synthetic unity? So notice that Jacobi makes the copula, the is, in a judgment, such as being is nothing, to be collapsing, to be pure identity. So, continuing, first of all, it must be said that when Jacobi assumes his position in absolute, that is abstract, space, time, and consciousness as well, he transposes himself into something which is empirically false and fixes himself there. There is no such thing as a spatially or temporally unlimited space or time. That is, none is empirically at hand which would not be filled with a continuous manifold of limited existence and of change, so that these limits and these changes would not belong unseparated and inseparable to spatiality. Consciousness is likewise filled with determinate sensation, representation, desire, and so forth. It does not exist in concreto, apart from some particular content or other. The transition to the empirical then goes without saying. Consciousness can indeed make empty space, empty time, and even empty consciousness or pure being its intended object and content, but it does not stay with them. Rather, from this emptiness it passes over. More than that, it forces itself over to a better content, that is, one which is somehow more concrete and to this extent, however bad as content, still better and truer. Precisely such a content is the synthetic as such, synthetic understood in its more general sense. Thus Parmenides has to make do with semblance and opinion, the opposite of being and truth. Spinoza likewise with attributes, modes, extension, movement, understanding, will, and so forth. The synthesis contains as well as exposes the untruth of those abstractions. In it they are in unity with their other, are not therefore as self-subsistent, not as absolute, but strictly as relative. The demonstration of the empirical unity of empty space and so forth Happier, can you continue reading?
I can read too, but
Yeah, if you can continue reading that, good. That's good.
okay. The demonstration of the empirical nullity of empty space and so forth is not, however, the task here. Consciousness can, of course, by means of abstraction, fill itself with such indeterminateness, and the abstractions to which it thus holds fast are the thugs of pure space, time, pure consciousness, pure being. It is the thug of pure space, etc., that is pure space, etc., taken in themselves, which is to be demonstrated to be null. That is, what must be demonstrated is that as such a thought, its opposite has already forced its way into it, that by itself it is already being that has gone outside itself, a determinateness. But this happens in them immediately. They are, as Jacobi correctly describes them, results of abstraction. They are expressly determinate as indeterminate. And this, to go back to their simplest form, is being. This indeterminateness is, however, precisely what constitutes their determinateness, for indeterminateness is opposed to determinateness. As opposed, it is therefore itself something determinate or negative, the pure, entirely abstract negative. This indeterminateness or abstract negation, which thus has being in it, is that to which reflection, whether external or internal, gives voice when it equates such a being with nothing, when it declares it to be an empty product of thought and nothingness. Or one can say, since being is the indeterminate, it is not the affirmative determinateness that it is. It is not being, but nothing. Do I continue?
Well, any comments or questions on it so far?
I mean, not for me, but Josh?
When I read, I don't understand a thing of what I'm reading. So then you can.
Oh, I can read. My mic was
okay.
a little.
Okay.
In the pure reflection of the beginning, as it is made in this logic with being as such, the transition is still hidden. Because being is posited as immediate, the nothing only breaks out in it immediately. All the subsequent determinations are, however, more concrete, like existence, which follows right after. There is already posited in existence that which contains and produces the contradiction of those abstractions, and consequently their transition. In being, when taken in that simplicity and immediacy, the memory that it is the result of a perfect abstraction, and that it is therefore already abstract negativity, nothing, is left back behind the science, which, starting explicitly from essence, will exhibit that one-sided immediacy as a mediated immediacy, where being is posited as concrete existence, and that which mediates being, the ground, is also posited.
All right, so the Jacobi section is done there, I think.
Yeah.
We'll stop there.
Okay, but can we? What was the point of the last 3 paragraphs? I'm sorry.
Yeah, hold on. So, well, he makes the critique of Jacobi's like exercise of abstraction, which he says it's. Oh my god. All right, sorry. So let's see. The thing about Jacobi gives examples of abstraction. And what does he say? Well, he says that Jacobi is empirically wrong in that, he makes his abstractions as knowing abstractions. for example. And remember that in the introductions, Hegel talks about this. By the way, it is like our voices and the noise in the background too much.
No, it's okay.
All right, so he says that the abstraction is just false, both in concept, because empirically, one, because he's abstracting from in the empirical. He's taking empirical concepts, and in concept, because if he was really dealing with those concepts as concepts, as not as intuitions, he would actually be dealing with something that was synthetic already. Stuff like space already has a synthetic content to it. It's a synthetic concept. It's already differentiated in its meaning. But as a pure intuition, obviously it wouldn't. But then he's saying Jacobi's not talking about space. Then he's not talking about real space. There's no such thing as infinite space in empirically. Just empty infinite space with no subjective orientation that we have. Such as top, up, down, left, right. We have a natural orientation in which we know what spatiality basically is. Even out in space, you're floating out in space as an astronaut. You know spatiality by the way that you move. It's not like you're a disembodied body with no directionality of perception, and you really have no sense of space. So it's false on those grounds. Second, he says that if he made the real abstraction, it would be exactly the same as being, in which it'd be a pure, indeterminate thought. But there is a difference in which the being which we begin with at the beginning, remember, is not determined as indeterminate, whereas Jacobi's indeterminate is determined as indeterminate. Sorry, were you saying something, Sorth?
Oh no, that I think I got it. It's like what we talked at the beginning about calling using the word being to trying to refer to pure being, but that being in reality naive intention and just an imagination that in fact has in one's mind something which is determinate, even if pure being is trying to is call it like that. It's just imagination.
Yeah. So he also makes the mention that consciousness can indeed make empty. Dang dogs. Consciousness can indeed make empty space, empty time, and even empty consciousness or pure being its intended object and content, but it does not stay with them. Rather, from this emptiness it passes over. More than that, it forces itself over to a better content, that is, one which is somehow more concrete, and to this extent, however bad as content, still better and truer. So even if we go like Parmenides or Spinoza and we say, okay, the only real thing is substance, or the only real thing is being, we don't shut up. We don't stop there. Clearly we want to say more. And we keep saying more, despite the fact that what we originally intended was, okay, what we said originally is the absolute, being is the absolute. What more is there to say? And yet, then Parmenides is forced to then start talking about regular everyday things, and then call them illusions, but nonetheless talk about them. And Spinoza has to talk about modes and attributes and all these other things that are more than substance within substance. They're not as real as substance. We always have to say these measures of reality, at the very least, when we try to speak in these ways. But the fact that we do this is telling of the falsehood of the original abstraction in the first place. So Hegel says, these are what syntheses, in the general sense, are. That when we make these abstractions, and then we feel this need to say something more about them, and then we actually do say something more about them because there really is something to say. That is synthetic, So the synthesis is natural. Like, there is no need to ask, well, why is it possible? Well, you just do it. So from abstraction, we naturally want to go to determinacy. From indeterminacy, we already have the springboard to determinacy. Like, the moment you've made this distinction between the absolute and yourself, you already are in a synthetic relation. The moment you realize that you've made an abstraction, you already have a synthetic relation. So, at least that's how I'm interpreting this. Let's see, is for the almost last paragraph, but this happens to be immediately when he's talking about the change. So, for example, right before that, he says, it is the thought of pure space, etc., that is, pure space, etc., taken in themselves, which is to be demonstrated to be null. That is, what must be demonstrated is that, as such a thought, its opposite has already forced its way into it. That by itself, it is already being that has gone outside itself, a determinate. So just this is jumping way ahead into the philosophy of nature, but in the philosophy of nature, like, the first concept is space, which is being that has gone outside itself. Space is self-externality. So space is already determinate. It actually cannot be the pure abstraction which Jacobi says it is. Space in its own pure self-abstraction is already a determinate thing. And while the nullity of being is its nothingness, that it nothings itself, it negates itself, the nullity of space is that it goes outside itself. And then I think it's actually a pretty, like, smart thing, like a pretty good phrase he makes in the 21.86 on page 74, the last paragraph, where he says, this indeterminateness or abstract negation, which thus has being in it, is that to which reflection, whether external or internal, gives voice when it equates such a being with nothing, when it declares it to be an empty product of thought, a nothingness. So the fact that being is a pure abstraction is the explanation of why it is. Reflectively, we can say, oh, it's not really a thought, it's nothing. I mean, it's more wordplay, I think. Any further comments, questions?
I'm not sure I got that sentence.
The one on the declares to be an empty product of thought, a nothingness.
Yes.
Let's see the whole paragraph. But this happens to in them immediately. They are, as Jacobi correctly describes them, results of abstraction. They are expressly determined as indeterminate, and this, to go back to their simplest form, is being. This indeterminateness is, however, precisely what constitutes the determinateness. For indeterminateness is opposed to determinateness. As opposed, it is therefore itself something determinate or negative. The pure, entirely abstract negative. This indeterminateness or abstract negation, which thus has being in it, is that to which reflection, whether external or internal, gives voice when it equates such being with nothing, when it declares it to be an empty product of thought, a nothingness. Or one can say, since being is the indeterminate, it is not the affirmative determinateness that it is not being, but nothing. I said here he's equating indeterminateness with the negative. So indeterminacy is the negative of determinacy. Being is indeterminate. It is the negative of determinacy. Therefore, it is nothing. So the prime meaning going on here is the negative negation. That if indeterminacy is negation of all determinateness, then obviously it won't be. If being is the negation of all beings, then, or the negation of all content, then it has no content. It is nothing.
Okay.
All right. So I think that's we've been going on long enough, and we'll leave it there for next time.
Yes. It's okay.